Okay. All right, well, it's very easy to introduce Bob because all you have to do actually is just type his name into Google and you can read everything that's been written about him in the magazines like The Atlantic and so forth. They've done all the work for you. They say that Bob has captured the beauty and diversity of public lands through thousands of images, and that his photos have been seen and shared by millions around the world. But I have to add something to that. Even though his photos are iconic, what has intrigued me the most as I followed his career path for what, Bob, almost 4 decades now, is that Bob's a wilderness manager for these gems. So he's married this artistry of photography with his expertise in caring for the protection of our lands. He's spent a career balancing permitted uses, which often totally conflict with each other, with safeguarding the sustainability of these places. And what comes out of that is his success in using the photos to inspire action. And I think that's what we're going to see tonight. So with that, we'll take it away, Bob. Oh dear.
Oh, no, am I unmuted?
Now you're unmuted.
Now I'm unmuted, okay. So yeah, let's keep this informal. I have some slides of the various protected areas that BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, manages around the West. And I'm going to start off with a little bit of an introduction on the agency itself, because I never heard of the agency when I was growing up in Western Pennsylvania back in the 70s, other than the last paragraph in a lot of the forestry textbooks that Sarah and I had would always mention there's this other agency that manages more federal land than any other one, but we don't know anything about it. So anyway, but I'll be glad, feel free to interrupt if you have questions. I can also try to add a couple of photo tips here and there for those of you that are into photography. But if there is a particular photo that you want to know how I captured it, I'd be glad to share that with you. So with that, let's see, let's start screen share. Share. All right, play from start. Okay, so this is a photo of the 6-shooters in southwest Utah, about an hour south of Arches National Park, in the Bears Ears National Monument, which is managed by the BLM. And just started that as my cover, so I didn't want to skip saying where that was. Oh shoot, that's not letting me oh, there we go. Okay. So we shared a little bit about myself. I grew up back in Western Pennsylvania, near not too far from Pittsburgh. I did get to New York off and on, and especially to New England as a kid. My whole knowledge of natural resources and natural areas as I was growing up was that forests are natural and non-forest areas are developed. Little did I know that as you move west in the country, I mean, I knew about prairies and deserts, you know, in theory, but I'd never been to, especially any desert areas. So, but when I went to undergraduate in forestry with Sarah at Penn State, and then I went down to Virginia Tech for grad school. And when I was there, ex-student of, actually it was one of Ben Twoit's students, Sarah, worked for the Bureau of Land Management in Colorado, and called, said, hey, do you know anybody, to one of my professors that might be interested in a temporary position? So I applied for it and ended up loading my truck up and moving to Colorado right out of grad school, and have been in the West ever since. So, you know, just happened to hit the BLM as an agency just to get out west. Little did I know I'd spend 34 years working for the agency, mostly, as Sarah said, in protected areas programs, particularly our wilderness programs, but also in some other aspects of the agency. So let's talk a little bit about the federal public domain. It's interesting, in New York, you guys have, I looked it up, 0.8% federal land base in New York State. I think Connecticut Iowa and Rhode Island are behind New York, but that's it. So you're near the bottom of the rung. When you move out into the western US, Nevada is the #1 state for federal lands. It's like, I think it's 90% plus of the Nevada acreage is managed by the federal government, one agency or another, and particularly the BLM. So these lands are shown on this map, with the green being national forests. The yellow is the Bureau of Land Management lands, which I'll touch on. And then we also show Indian reservations, national parks and such. Interestingly, in the east, all the national forests and parks in the east were actually acquired by the federal government. A lot of them at the turn of the last century, the 1900s, after they had been logged over and damaged by mismanagement, the Forest Service went back in and picked it up. And then, places like Acadia and Shenandoah, the National Park Service picked up lands there. New York has an interesting history as you guys know, you have a great state program for land protection and management, with areas like the Catskills and the Adirondack Forest Preserve. But the lands that I'll be talking about are the original public domain lands, which made up at one point 75% of the US acreage. And now the remaining public domain lands, which are managed by the BLM, I'm just going to say for short, make up about 10% of the nation's land base. So all the states west of the original 13 colonies, when they came into the Union, especially as you get further west, the federal government did not just turn all that land over to the states. They retained most of the land under federal ownership, and there were laws like the Homestead Act, Timber and Stone Act, various ways that land was disposed of to different private landowners. And then, of course, we had the national parks movement, where parts of the public domain were set aside as parks. When Gifford Pinchot came along, a lot of the areas were set aside as national forests. So the BLM lands are always referred to as the leftover lands, what's left of the public domain that was never transferred into private ownership. Now, in the 1960s, there was a turn of interest in the fact that let's not continue disposing of these public domain lands, but they do have values, great resource values. A lot of them are in the arid, inhospitable parts of the Intermountain West and the desert areas, but they have a lot of public values, and we should retain them under federal stewardship. So that led to the formation of the BLM as a permanent land manager. Not until 1976 did the agency get its mandate. It's somewhat similar to the Forest Service in that it's a multiple use mandate. So there's a lot of different uses that are allowed to go on the BLM lands. And I'm not going to scare you off with development photos. This is going to be primarily a conservation oriented discussion, but the BLM is very much a workhorse agency. And it's been interesting to work for the agency because you get to see, you just think that gold bracelets show up from nowhere. Well, they show up starting in big open pit mines like this upper right hand corner of this gold mine in Nevada. Lots of oil and gas development goes on in the federal lands. The BLM manages all the federal mineral estate for the federal government. There's a lot of livestock grazing on federal lands in the West. And I don't know if any of you have watched Yellowstone, the series on, I forget what's subscriber channel it is with Kevin Costner, but it's a good example of the power of ranchers in the American West. They wield a higher level of political influence than they probably should as far as management of BLM and Forest Service lands go. But the lands areas are open for various types of recreation use, ranging from non-motorized to motorized activities such as OHV use in the lower corner here. And there was a long time where this multiple use mandate, and some people still look at it as all these uses should be allowed to occur simultaneously on all public lands in the West. And obviously, when you think that through, you can't have an open pit mine and a picnic area in the same spot. But you always hear, usually it's on the conservation side of things. If somebody wants to protect an area as a national monument, or there's a movement afoot to designate new wilderness, or say, you're taking that out of multiple use. So it's a misused term, because ever since the BLM and the Forest Service, as I said, has a similar mandate, were identified as agencies. They've gone through planning processes to zone various areas for compatible uses. So yes, the history of the agency is strongly tied to laws like the Mining Law of 1872, which was to encourage settlement of the West, the Livestock Grazing Act, such as the Taylor Grazing Act. But the public values and public interests in these public lands over my 34-year career switched immensely, from not knowing what these landscapes were and just an interest more in commodity management and development, to more of a very heavy focus on protection, at least of appropriate landscapes. But that doesn't mean these landscapes aren't still major workhorse areas. That lower right photo shows a major solar development in the California desert. A lot of the large solar facilities that are going in the Western US are on leases provided by the BLM, as well as wind energy. And a lot of folks look at these areas and say, well, these are just desert lands, they're not hurting anything. But there's some major environmental impacts that occur in the footprints of these facilities, both solar and wind. The sage grouse is an interesting bird that once was thriving in the Intermountain West, but with a lot of the various developments, and especially the fire regime and the introduction of a non-native species called cheatgrass from I think it's from Eastern Europe, has caused the fire regime to change, that burned away a lot of the sagebrush. So this is an example of an endangered species that the BLM has to, and the Forest Service as well, manage to balance development with protection of the species, and lots of controversy. This is a male sage grouse strutting for a female that's behind him that could care less what he's doing, but they're pretty interesting birds. On the top left corner of this is actually a lithium evaporation mine in Silver City, Nevada. There's a huge push for lithium development in the US now. China owns the majority of offshore lithium cobalt production that's needed for renewable energy use, particularly for lithium ion battery development. And there's a big push for additional mine sites in the Western US on federal lands, particularly BLM land. But again, there's lots of impacts associated with this. So no matter how smug we all want to feel when we're driving our battery powered hybrids, they're just, we all need to remember. I just read an article where America's demands for long distance battery powered cars is resulting in higher demands for larger batteries. So we're even, just like we make a footprint with big houses, we're going to start making footprints with big electric vehicles. So we need to kind of scale down our expectations in some ways. But bottom line is, these lands are open for a lot of uses. The agency's mandate is identified by Congress, but it sways based on the administration because it's so broad. Typically goes more into a commodity focus during the Republican administrations, and more of a preservation focus during the Democratic administrations, but still, encompasses that whole range of uses. So now what I want to talk about is, as the BLM evolved and got its mandate in the 1970s, and particularly starting with the Clinton administration in the early or the 1990s, a lot of the public domain land shown in yellow here have been identified through congressional actions or through presidential decree as protected areas. And these areas are just, to me, they're some of the most amazing places on the planet. And partly because I can go out in many of these areas and have them completely to myself. And they're truly the wide open West. Even though they're starting to get a lot more use than they used to, there's still areas where you can go for days without seeing another person. They're pretty special places. And I forget who was at the Mighty Five in Utah, but this is a photo I like to show. This is Delicate Arch in Arches National Park, and I came up. This is a photo's about 20 years old, but I went up there on the night of a full moon, thinking there'd be a half dozen other people there, and I gave up photographing the moon and just photographed the crowd that was there. And so, all the federal agencies have different mandates for good reason, and some of the mandates overlap. And some people have said to the various other agencies, why don't we just make all these lands that BLM and the Forest Service manages that are protected into national parks? In some ways, that could be a good idea. In other ways, I think it's kind of a nice, healthy balance and competition to have. Each agency has a little different take on how to manage landscapes. The BLM, whether it be because the agency wants to focus on primitive undeveloped areas, or just because it never gets budgets to develop visitor centers and things, typically manages that off the grid, explore on your own. You're not going to have a paved loop trail and visitor center through almost all BLM lands. There's one area that's an exception that I'll show you in a minute. So, and when I started with the BLM, there wasn't much of a knowledge about the agency. And then as I started getting a reputation for a photographer, I realized, hey, this is a good opportunity to increase public awareness of the agency. And for the first 20 years of my career, I would share slides for brochures and other presentations that somebody in the headquarters office in Washington gave. But then with the development of the internet and social media, like many things, the interest in my photographs exploded, and they were shared around the web and around the world, particularly once they started showing up on the Department of Interior's social media accounts. So it was really interesting to see that transition during my career from these little known places to areas that are very highly regarded now, and the public is very aware of them compared to what they were early in my career. And I'm glad I had a small part to do with that. So now what I'd like to do is take you around, and this might get a little bit bureaucratic. I'll try to keep it from being bureaucratic, but the different designations that occur on Bureau of Land Management lands. And a lot of these designations also are based on congressional acts that apply to other federal lands across the West. So this first one I'll talk about as a national monument designation. And this photo, if you drive between Capitol Reef and Bryce Canyon, most of the land that you're going through is the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument in Utah, which is I believe it's the largest national monument on land in the US. It's a couple million acres, some of the most remote, stark, beautiful landscapes in the American West. This is the last area of the lower 48 that was mapped during sometime in the early 1900s. Those of you that have followed or aware, what was it, Edward Roos? He disappeared in this country back in the 1930s. And this is also some of the country Edward Abbey would go through in some of his trumps. But this particular shot also, just from a photo standpoint, is taken after sunset. And I really love taking photos, especially when the sky lights up after sunset and you have some clouds, in this case, a breaking thunderstorm because the light flattens out, but it also gets a really warm quality to it. So I used to put my camera away after sunset. And now I realize that, the next 20 or 30 minutes after sunset are some of my favorite times to photograph. So national monuments, one of the reasons they're popular right now is because under the Antiquities Act of 1906, I believe it was passed, the president is allowed to unilaterally identify and designate national monuments. President Roosevelt started designating right after the act was passed. The Grand Canyon was one of the first national monuments. So one of the big arguments is the Antiquities Act says that a monument shall be the smallest area compatible with protecting the values within its boundaries. So during the last administration, President Trump actually reduced the footprint of the Grand Staircase National Monument, as well as the Bears Ears National Monument in Utah, using that rationale that they were larger than they had to be. And that was the first time that had been done to that level by any administration. So, but with Congress at an impasse right now on any type of conservation bill, I think you'll probably see President Biden, or hopefully, come out with some new national monument designations. They can be on any federal lands, although by nature they're normally on Forest Service, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service lands, because the national parks are already designated as either parks or monuments. I should mention that normally, until the Grand Staircase was designated, lands that were identified as national monuments were transferred out of BLM's jurisdiction over to the Park Service. But one manager in particular in California really pushed with Bruce Babbitt, who was then Secretary of Interior, that if you keep plucking these cherries from the BLM's land portfolio and expect the agency to continue focusing on conservation, it's just not going to happen. You need to let the agency manage some of these crown jewels and show that they can be protected by the agency. So that's after that point in the early 1990s, almost all the new national monuments that are designated on federal lands stay with the agency that they were identified on. And some of the objects that are called for under the Antiquities Act can be cultural values, scientific values. This is an interesting value. Sarah and I are both drone pilots, and this is a drone shot that I took in the Carrizo Plain National Monument, which is one of my favorite places down in South Central California. It's the last undeveloped remnant of the ecosystem that once covered California's Great Central Valley. Has more endangered species than anywhere else in California. But also, this is a peculiar spot where the San Andreas Fault is going through the middle of this photo. And there's a creek coming down from the mountain range above, and you can see where it offsets that's about a couple hundred feet actually. And then it starts again. That's just from the slippage of the San Andreas Fault, one block moving north, one south. So it's kind of a textbook study in scientific circles as far as the fault structures of the Western US, or the world, I should say. So just kind of a fun spot. So one of the cool national monuments the BLM manages is the California Coastal National Monument. And again, think of the agency's history, those unwanted lands that were never grabbed by homestead folks or people under the Timber and Stone Act or other private development. Who would want rocks off the coast? You can't build a house on them. So most of those rocks stayed under the jurisdiction of the BLM, and they were identified or designated as a national monument. I think it was around 2000, but lo and behold, as more became known about these, and that was well before the designation of the monument, they're like the last refugia of marine mammals and marine bird species in California. You have the most populous state in the union, and just offshore you have these areas with sea lion, elephant seal haulouts, seabird nesting areas. This lower photo is a common murre nesting colony. These birds live out at sea their whole lives, except when they come in to nest. And they count on the safety of those rocks because they're offshore, so there's no predation on their eggs. But this particular rock has about 40,000 birds nesting on it. So they're just like wildlife hotels. I spent a lot of time working in this area, so I'm pretty it's pretty special to me. This is the Big Sur coastline, by the way. And this is the Bears Ears National Monument, which is about an hour and a half, 2 hours south of the Moab area, and one of the highest densities of ancient pueblos, or what were once called Anasazi Indian sites in the US. Just, you can walk down these canyons and there's cliff dwellings and there's potsherds and there's pictographs, petroglyphs. And the cool thing is there's no fence blocking you from walking through these. It's the honor system. You really have to respect them and protect them. And unfortunately, that doesn't always occur. There's been historically a major amount of pot hunting is kind of innate to the local culture in this part of Utah. So it's been an uphill battle for all the federal agencies to try to protect the remaining antiquities and sacred sites that are left in these areas. This is also the first national monument. The Navajo tribe is going to jointly manage it along with the BLM and the Forest Service. So encourage you guys, if you're willing to get off the beaten path and explore a little bit, to check out Cedar Mesa and the Bears Ears National Monument. This is the Big Man panel, which lives up to its name. I have a photo with me standing below these, and they're taller than I am, which isn't that tall, but so the next designation, and this is unique to the BLM, and I'll just touch on these a little bit, are national conservation areas and similar designations. All the rest of the designations we're going to talk about require Congress to work together, to pass a law to get these areas protected. And the King Range is one of the first protected areas BLM managed, going all the way back to 1974. I spent about 10 years working here. This is an area called Black Sands Beach. The coastline from here north for about 25 miles is completely undeveloped. It was so rugged that Highway 1 was forced inland on this part of the California coast. So it's one of the most pristine parts of the Pacific coast and in the lower 48. And 4,000 foot mountains rising straight above the ocean. So very a beautiful area. This is the one example of an area that the BLM manages that is very similar in national parks, just because it has to be, and that's the Red Rock Canyon National Conservation Area in Nevada. If any of you that go to Vegas, if you go about 10 miles west of the Strip, need a break from all your losses, the Red Rock Canyon area is a great spot to escape the Vegas the gaming and craziness. But it is extremely popular. It would be the 16th most visited national park if it were a national park, just because it's so close to Vegas. So it does have the Loop Road and the visitor center, but all the area from the cliffs on to the west is also protected as wilderness. So there's absolutely no development in those areas. And I'll touch on wilderness here in a minute. So it's pretty cool to be able to sit. I sat up on the cliffs above the Loop Road on one of these peaks, and that photo on the lower left is looking over the Strip. So you're looking to the west or east and just seeing all of, the Luxor light shining up into the sky. I think you can even see it there, and all this development, but you turn the other way and you're the only person on Earth. I spent 2 days up on top of these mountains and didn't see anybody. And that's true in the national parks too, if you get off of the beaten path. Another special designation, like a national conservation area, this is the Alabama Hills National Scenic Area. And you're looking up at Mount Whitney, which is the highest point in the lower 48, about 14,500 feet. So the higher elevations are part of the Inyo National Forest, but the foreground, the Alabama Hills, are now protected as National Scenic Area. And the local community really wanted their own kind of flavor of a protection for this area, because it's been the lifeblood of Lone Pine, California, since the town was basically founded as a place where Hollywood would go to make old westerns and other types of movies. It was close enough to Los Angeles. It's probably 4 hours from LA, that it was accessible. But if you know these rocks, this rhyolite and these rounded boulders, you can pick them out in movies all the time. They were, when Robert Downey Jr. was selling some of his equipment and testing it in Afghanistan at the beginning of the first Iron Man, that was the Alabama Hills in the background. This Django Unchained is on the lower left there. Gunga Din is black and white on the lower right, which was an interesting movie. So yeah, all these different movies are filmed on the Alabama Hills area. So the community really wanted to protect the scenery, but also allow for that, those various uses to occur. Another national conservation area that's one of the more remote ones is the High Rock, Black Rock, High Rock Canyon Immigrant Trails National Conservation Area north of Reno. And this is one of the largest intact landscapes that basically the immigrants traveling west on the California Trail had to cross this. It was the most arid part of their trek before they got to the greener country in California. The Sierra Nevada would be behind me. And Black Rock itself is that black rock sitting right in the middle of the playa there. So that was a landmark to the travelers, that they were halfway across the desert. There's some hot springs there below that rock, and the oxen were so thirsty when they got there, they would dive into those springs, and they were like 190 degrees. So the oxen did not live through that, but it's just an amazing history. And a lot of that history is still intact when you were out on the landscape. You just don't get that with a little postage stamp area. That's why these areas, a lot of them protect these vast landscapes. The landscapes of the West, especially the arid West, are so open that it's hard to explain to someone who hasn't been west that, you know, you can see a development 30 or 40 or 50 miles away, just as it's hard to explain to someone who's grown up in the desert that you can be in New York or Pennsylvania in a 100-acre parcel of woods and get lost for hours. You know, it's just that total different landscape capacity. So some of these vast landscapes are pretty rare and pretty amazing to have in the West. And this is just one of the inscriptions of the immigrants. Amazingly, as much as you hear about the Donner Party and other tragedies along the immigrant trails, I think I can't remember the exact number, but there was a 90-something percent success rate in immigrants making it out to California and Oregon. So not as high a death rate as one would think. There's also a lot of other interesting things that occur and have occurred in the Black Rock Desert since before the area was protected as a national conservation area. One of these is Burning Man. I don't know if those of you who are familiar with Burning Man, this is the playa or dry lake bed where Burning Man's held each year in and around Labor Day. A lot of people have opinions of Burning Man that have never been there, but it's pretty amazing event if you like art. I mean, I've been to major art museums and installations all around the US, at least, including New York City and San Francisco. And I've never found anywhere where so much is packed in so creatively into an area. Pretty amazing place for that. It's also the Playa is the site of the world land speed record, which was like 800 and some miles an hour. It still holds that because it's such a huge flat area that it was a great place to have that. The nice thing about Burning Man, even though it's a high level of use, they really practice leave no trace, and then the BLM requires them to. So they're not allowed to dump any gray water. When the event's over, it basically has to be totally clean, like they had never been there. And they do a pretty good job with practicing leave no trace. Okay, now we're going to move back into a designation that occurs on all federal lands. And this is actually one of the few national designations of public lands that occurs in New York State. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was passed in 1968, and it was during an era of major dam building, or it was the culmination of efforts to offset all this dam building that was occurring, the Lake Powells, the Lake Meads, the Corps of Engineers flood control dams, with some areas of rivers that should be protected in their free-flowing state and allowed to run naturally. And the Tox Island Dam, which is over along the Delaware River south of you guys, was one of those major dam proposals that would have flooded about 40 miles of the Delaware River, and was very controversial, and ended up that they didn't build the dam, and the Delaware is now part of the Wild and Scenic Rivers system. So it would be very hard to ever get a dam built on that stretch of river. It would take an act of Congress to do that. And to date, no major stretches of Wild and Scenic Rivers have been undesignated. Yeah, Wild and Scenic Rivers are, obviously thought of for recreation, fishing, different values that you normally associate with large rivers, but also this is the Rio Grande Wild and Scenic River in New Mexico, very important riparian landscape in the desert of New Mexico, important bird nesting area on the cliffs above the river. The Rogue Wild and Scenic River in Oregon was one of the first designated. That's Zane Grey's cabin. The Western author Zane Grey on the upper right, he wrote a lot about the Rogue River, and just like an Instagram influencer, the river became so popular based on his writings that he went up to the Umpqua River because he said it was just too crowded. And it's like, well, it's your fault, guy. You brought everyone in here. But it is a fun river if you want a wilderness experience, but there's still some lodges along the river that you can get pampered in. Some of the rivers up in Alaska are more popular for winter recreation. People snowmobile, snowshoe up and down some of the waterway corridors. This is Beaver Creek near Fairbanks, Alaska. The aurora, other than the solar eclipse, is probably my favorite celestial thing that I've ever witnessed. Those of you that have seen it, you can actually see it moving. It's just mesmerizing. And it was about 20 below when I took this photo, and no, I did not stay in that tent. There was a little cabin behind it that I stayed in. A lot of these river corridors are really important for Native Americans, historic fisheries. This is Shears Falls, which is a salmon catching spot that's been used for hundreds of years by the Warm Springs tribe in Oregon. Again, I mentioned wildlife already. And when we think of rivers, we think of large, Delaware River, Hudson River type things. But the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act allows for designation of small streams and rills. And this is the Amargosa River, which flows underground for most of its length, but it actually is the river that in a wet year drains into Death Valley. It's home to what's probably the rarest mammal in the US. The Amargosa vole lives in these rushes through here. There's like 75 of them left that fluctuates up and down. Desert pupfish live in the stream itself. It's much saltier. I think it's like 10 times saltier than the ocean, or some that don't quote me on that, but it's definitely, it's not, you don't want to drink that water. So yeah, pretty amazing resource for probably, the driest part of the Mojave Desert. This area might get an inch or two of rain a year. So that water in that riparian area is definitely lifeblood. Okay, now we'll move on to the last couple designations. National Scenic and Historic Trails. The National Trails Act for scenic trails was passed the same day as the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. President Johnson signed it. And it was identified to protect long distance trail corridors. You have a couple of them, the North Country Trail and the Appalachian Trail going through New York. The Appalachian and the Pacific Crest, I believe, were the first two trails designated in '68 under this act. National Historic Trails were added later, and these are not necessarily trails with treads, but routes that were important to the history of the United States, some part of our history. And this is a stretch of the Pony Express National Historic Trail in Wyoming. So, you know, a lot of allure around that trail, even though it was only used for under 2 years as far as mail delivery goes. But so this is a map showing the National Scenic and Historic Trails. You can see there's one National Historic route through New York, the Washington Rochambeau Revolutionary Trail route. But as you get to other parts of the country, there are trails that are tied in with immigration to the Western US, to Spanish influence coming up from Mexico on the El Camino de Real, and the old Spanish trail connecting Santa Fe to Los Angeles, Trail of Tears, and unfortunately some very sad trails tied to Native Americans in both the west and the south central part of the country. So pretty amazing. The historic trails usually have an auto tour route or something that approximates the trail corridor itself, so that you can get you know, a feel for what's like and some of the significant events that occurred on these trails. And this is just a stretch of the Continental Divide Trail on the BLM land in New Mexico. It's an interesting trail, a little more remote than the Appalachian or even the Pacific Crest Trail, as far as there's not even trail tread on parts of this trail. You just kind of bushwhack it, and there are signs that you can follow. But a lot of people think of Reese Witherspoon and the, you know, through hikers on these trails, which are a big thing. It's kind of fun. I've run into them along both the CDT and the Pacific Crest Trail, and just hearing their stories is pretty amazing. But I think it's also important, and you guys see this in New York, that a lot of these trails, and especially the connecting trails, are accessible for short day hikes. And I think most people that hike the Appalachian Trail probably do day hikes on it, and it's the same with the Pacific Crest. This is right outside of Palm Springs. So, oh, and I haven't been given photo tips, but one on kids is don't make them stand still. If you want them to laugh, get them running. They just can't not laugh if you get them moving. So I always get kids riled up. Their parents get upset sometimes trying to calm them down, and I'm like, no, they're having fun. So this is Lemhi Pass along the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail in Idaho. This is where Sacagawea escorted Lewis and Clark over to the western slope of the divide to try to find a passage to the northwest. And if it wasn't for her Native American knowledge of and her tribal history in the area, they never would have probably made it, or at least would have had a lot more trouble. Interestingly, not too far from here, downriver on part of the Lewis and Clark Trail, that Lewis and Clark went through that area, I think it was in 1805. And only 72 years later, the Nez Perce tribe, led by Chief Joseph, was basically routed by the cavalry through this area, and they were captured just north of here in Cow Creek along the Nez Perce Trail as they were trying to flee towards freedom in Canada. So, you know, pretty amazing pride and triumph of settlement with Lewis and Clark, followed 70 years later by just agony and defeat and sadness among how we treated the Native Americans. So the Nez Perce Trail is one way to at least commemorate this on the landscape. And one of the more famous trails that the BLM has stewardship over is the Iditarod, which is actually a historically was a trail to some gold camps in Alaska, but it became famous with the dog sled teams getting diphtheria medicine to Nome. And there's, it's interesting. I don't want to take a stand on dog treatment, but I do have to say, when I was out working the trail when the mushers were coming through, they live for those dogs. It's like every second of their life is focused on feeding, bedding down, dealing with these dogs. Mushers are a special breed of folks that I think would rather live with their dogs than interact with people. So, but that said, I know there's definitely some controversy about how these dogs are pushed during the race. This is God, I'm trying to forget this guy's name, but he won the Iditarod this year. This is about a 5-year-old photo. But those trail shelter cabins, the BLM and the other agencies that have lands along the trail provide those. And the mushers actually use them. I thought we'd have the cabin to ourselves, and like one of the nights there were like 6 or 7 mushers that were sleeping on all my camera gear. They just basically crawled in and fell on the floor. And I'm like, if I try to grab my camera, am I going to, change the outcome of the race and get in trouble? But I think I finally did. So wilderness and wilderness study areas are the last 2 designations. I know we're getting short on time. Am I doing okay, Sarah, for a few? Okay. So wilderness is the most protective of the federal designations. And the movement for wilderness started back in, during the time when the national parks movement started and the Adirondack Preserve was created in the late 1800s. But as time moved forward, especially in some of the national parks, there was realization that there was development occurring there, especially the railroads pushed for development and lodging. There were dams like Hetch Hetchy going in Yosemite, and even a dam proposed for the Grand Canyon. So there was an effort, and the Forest Service actually supported it administratively, to identify areas that were set aside with absolutely no development other than foot travel and horseback travel. And these would be designated wilderness. These are places where nature is allowed to take its course as much as possible, and human intervention is minimized. Much easier said than done. So the Wilderness Act was finally passed in 1964, and its author, Sarah, was from Tionesta, PA, Howard Zonheiser. So it's kind of cool to have an Eastern author of an act that protects so much land in the West. These are just a few examples of areas that the BLM manages. This is about an hour northwest of Arches National Park. This is the San Rafael Swell area of Utah and the Little Grand Canyon. Just want to show you there's some amazing areas that are not national parks in the West that you can go to and see no one. So this there is a road that goes down through here, but both sides of this are designated wilderness, so there'll never be any development, never be any roads. Even though the BLM and the Forest Service have multiple use mandates, which allows for mineral development, when these areas are designated, they're withdrawn from any future mineral claims or any development like that. So they're very highly protected. One of the things I really stress is you have to be prepared when you go off into some of these areas. This is an area along the San Rafael Reef, and I was hiking in here. It's Little Wild Horse Canyon, which unfortunately has been the site of numerous drownings. It's a very popular slot canyon, and you can see that little darker orange going up the wall up in the upper left-hand photo. That's me hiking there. As I went further into the canyon, I realized that that was not just a different color of sandstone. That was from a recent flash flood that occurred earlier that week. And when I got into the slot part on the right there, the mud was up about 25 feet up the walls. So about a year after I was in there, two little girls drowned. A thunderstorm was occurring not overhead, about 10 miles away from them, but just a flash flood went down the stream. So we always stress that if you're going to explore places, some of these remote spots, and again, this is true in any agency's lands, you really need to be prepared to be on your own and know the local issues as far as safety goes. Just another area, this is one of my favorite trips. It was stressful to photograph the eclipse, having 4 minutes. And I was trying to get, I could have shot, and I did shoot photos of the sun where it fills the frame, but I could have been in Portland or Peoria taking that photo. So I wanted to get a photo of the eclipse in the landscape. So that's where I got it, up at Herd Lake here in Jerry Peak Wilderness in Idaho. If you guys are going to have an eclipse over by Buffalo here in a couple years, I think it's 3 or 4 years down the road. It's going to come through southern Canada. And don't settle for 98%. Get in the line of totality. Whatever you do, make it work. It's something that you can't describe. I mean, it's just totally amazing. Okay, so the last designation is wilderness study areas, and the BLM has about 11 million acres of these. So that's about 4 times the size of the whole Adirondack park and preserve that we studied back in the 80s and early 90s for potential wilderness designation, recommended them to Congress as to whether or not they should be designated. And unfortunately, Congress has not taken up their part of the effort on a lot of these areas. Probably a third maybe of them have been either designated or some of them released back into multiple use management, but they're kind of in a holding pattern until Congress makes a decision on them. But interestingly, a lot of them have since become national monuments, because since Congress won't get off their rear ends and agree on something, the president has unilaterally protected some of these areas via national monuments. Different level of protection, but definitely protection. So just an area, one of my favorite areas, about 2 hours from my place here in California, I go up to when I need to escape. And this is just a photo shot showing differences of light. I love shooting into the sun at sunrise and sunset. You get the backlighting on the paintbrush there. And again, that top photo is right before sunrise, where you get that pink flat light. This is my partner Noah in the Red Cloud Peak WSA in Colorado. And I haven't tried it in the East, but with aspens, it's kind of fun to go out shooting in the moon, just like you would in the sun. I love backlighting fall colors. Should have done this about 2 weeks ago. You guys probably only have 3 leaves left, but anyway, it's kind of fun to get out at night and do things with the moon that with lighting angles that you also can do with the sun. So play around with the moon too. And then again, they're important for wildlife. I don't know why I included that, but I didn't know antelope had black tongues. So just one of these beautiful badland areas, which were considered wasteland, and some people still consider them wasteland, but I think they're some of the most beautiful landscapes in the American West. These are a couple areas just quickly that are being proposed for national monument designation, again, because there's interest in various organizations. All of these protections are generally through a legislative process that includes a lot of grassroots efforts by community groups such as yours to get them protected. So this is one of them in Southwest Colorado on the Dolores River. Beautiful area just west of Telluride. And this is another area in Arizona, the Great Bend of the Gila, which is being proposed for designation. It has one of the, I don't know if any of you are familiar with I don't even know what they call them, the sun spears, where the ancient ones studied the stars, and at the solstice there's a sun dagger going through this the middle of the sun and this particular image in the top right. I was there about 2 weeks after the solstice, and I took the photo at the bottom, so that's what it normally looks like. But it's pretty amazing how they were able to calculate all that. And lastly, I just wanted to cover Alaska. This is the largest block of public land in the country. It's about the size of Indiana, I believe, 24 million acres. It's called the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska, and it was originally managed by the Navy, but transferred over to the BLM for management. And it is there is a focus on petroleum development, although almost none of it has been developed to date, which is pretty cool because it's an incredibly sensitive area. But it's equally managed for subsistence use for Native Alaskans. And I was fortunate enough to be up there in both summer and winter. I mean, the most vast place I've ever been. It's just like the things you see on ice road truckers and stuff. We landed on an ice runway at this one spot we stopped. I was pretty impressed that the Native Alaskans really count on subsistence for the majority of their diet, at least in northern Alaska. It's not just to subsidize grocery shopping, it's the other way around. So this was actually an effort of the community to go to put seal skins on their whaling boat, which they'll go out and use this spring for whale hunting. And again, just some shots of the wildlife in this area. The Arctic Ocean was a lot different than I was expecting. I was thinking there'd be a sandy beach with a bunch of walrus on it, and as I learned about it, you basically have this permafrost going right up to the edge of the ocean, and with climate change and ice melting off earlier, this shot's from June, there's a lot more wave erosion as well as permafrost melting right on the shore. So that's why the water is so muddy. So it's a very sensitive area to sea level rise. When I've been to Alaska, I don't think there's anyone who questions climate change and sea level rise. They might question the cause of it and whether humans are a cause, but it's very evident in things like permafrost melt and coastal erosion. Okay, we're done. I just wanted to show I don't just take pictures of the West. I was back in Pennsylvania and West Virginia last week and the week before. This is the Clarion Wild and Scenic River in north central Pennsylvania, probably about an hour south of the New York border, up by it flows into the Alleghenies. So very beautiful area. And then this is another area I was 2 weeks ago, the Allegheny Front down in central West Virginia. Those are blueberries and red spruce trees that are on top of the ridge. So with that, I am done. And I know we went over a little, but Sarah said it was a soft landing. So
Bob, that was just fascinating. I'm going to ask everybody, I think we're a small enough group that everybody can just unmute themselves and we'll just take questions from people as they speak up. So if everybody could just hit their mute button and join the conversation.
It's still sunny here, so I'm going to pull my blind down a little bit.
So one of the questions I had, Bob, I'll just start it out because you touched on it a little bit, but how much did you see with the changes in political administrations, how much did that affect BLM day to day in the site with what you're doing and how you're managing and day-to-day activities?
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually started under the Reagan administration right at the tail end, and there was definitely, freeze on hiring, a focus on more development versus protection. And then I worked under both Bushes, Clinton, Obama, and Trump. And I don't want to start a political argument, but the agency swayed back and forth between administrations. Like under the Bush administration, it's like just don't get in the way of mineral and oil and gas development, conservation folks, and you can do your own thing. The Trump administration really they moved the BLM's headquarters from Washington, D.C. to Grand Junction, Colorado. So I think about 10 people out of 300 moved to the west with that move, because it's not like the old days where people can pick up and move their families. So we basically lost our entire senior staff, as well as a lot of political influence in Washington. They were saying, we want to get the decision makers closer to the land, but the agency has about 9,000 employees. You think 300 could work out of Washington, D.C. It's not a big chunk of employees. So yeah, there was, and then the D designation of Bears Ears and the big chunk of the Grand Staircase was unprecedented. The Bush administration, after Clinton designated a bunch of new national monuments, sent letters out to the governors saying, do you want any of these areas reduced or rescinded? And none of the governors did, so they were left intact. But so yeah, again, I don't want you asked the question. It was a very difficult administration to work within, and I'm glad I outlasted them before I retired.
Yeah, I am too. And maybe you even have a little more freedom to talk about things now than you did before you retired.
Oh, I do, yeah. And I have to admit, one of my by the way, my official job in the BLM was never photography. I was a planning coordinator, wilderness specialist. I did it on the side, but I had supportive supervisors who would say, if you get a local office to fund your travel, then you can go. And so there were times I'd get out 5, 6 weeks, 7 weeks a year, which is pretty substantial. But anyway, a lot of my photos of areas that were under question for removing protective status, the national monuments in particular, because the president can do that, all of my images were public domain. So all the environmental groups plucked them off the BLM's Flickr site and used them to showcase, look what the president is doing to these amazing resources. So that was about as active as I could be as a government employee, and at least feel satisfied that I had a small part in. I mean, let the pictures tell the story.
I have a question about the initial stats that you showed about percentage of the country that was under BLM management. Did all of those percentages assume complete sovereignty over Western states as opposed to the natives actually owning anything?
They were, however we assumed we had sovereignty over the land, whether, the Louisiana Purchase, Alaska Purchase, treaties with Mexico, reneged upon treaties with various tribes. So yeah, I'm not going to make a stand over.
No, I'm just asking the question. I understand.
I think if you dug down into all those treaties, you could probably cut a lot of that land back. I said it was public domain land. The BLM didn't come into existence until the 1940s. The General Land Office was the predecessor agency to the BLM, and there was a very corrupt agency, disposed of land. I mean, you hear all these stories out west.
The white man owned everything, right?
That
was the assumption.
I mean, yeah, it's truly sad. I mean, I worked a lot with tribes in my past job with the BLM, and I've worked with them since I retired. And it's just, there's just no way to explain how we screwed the tribes over. It's sad.
And really no way to unwind it.
No, although there's some things that are at least happening. I mean, I love the fact that they have all the casinos that everyone's spending money.
I do too.
But, and I have to say the Native Alaskans were not treated as poorly as the tribes. There were a lot of Native claim lands in Alaska that I don't know if we learned from our mistakes, so to speak, but yeah, the treaties were agreed upon with ANILCA and some of that legislation, but yeah, so sad story.
Next question. Somebody else.
Any other questions? You know, while you're thinking about it, there's another one. I mean, a lot of it was just new information and fascinating, but I'd never thought about how quickly the pressures on BLM land have changed, like with the lithium that you talked about, or the solar panels, how quickly these new things arise. And with the solar panels, what are some of the biggest management issues for that? What kinds of things are the
Well, I
constraints that
mean,
we might not know about?
wind energy is an easier one because you also have that back east. And one of the biggest issues, in addition to the footprint, are bird strikes. You just have, golden eagles in particular get whacked all the time by wind turbines out in the west, and they're trying to do all kinds of stuff with radar and things where the turbines will stop if a bird's sighted. But it's there's a big solar facility in near Las Vegas that's actually a concentrated solar array, and the solar panels look like a lake bed. So waterfowl fly down thinking they're landing on a lake, and they get vaporized by the solar array. So there's
They're not solar panels. On that one, they're mirrors.
Yeah, mirrors. Yeah. They're not. You're right. It's not a solar, but when it's funny having worked with an agency that has to do all of this. It's interesting working like in meetings with the Sierra Club where they're arguing against solar development. And rightly so, they're pushing for rooftop solar and distributed generation. But I flew into Dallas last week or 2 weeks ago when I was flying back east. I flew over probably 20 subdivisions of new homes and not one solar panel on it. Not one. I'm not saying just a few. I mean, I've never seen it, and it's one of the sunniest places in the country. And so there's issues with
there's room
big
to grow.
industry. What's that?
There's room to grow.
Yeah, there's room to grow. And unfortunately, big power companies want consolidated development. But one of the things is people look at the desert as this vast empty space, but there's just an amazing array of unique species out there that aren't necessarily as charismatic as a big sugar maple or an old growth fir tree, but creosote bush or saguaros, or it's a very sensitive landscape like anywhere else, and it's slower to heal. There's an area east of Palm Springs that's being looked at for a national monument, and you can still see tank tracks when Patton was training his army for maneuvers in North Africa. So there's just tank tracks all over the desert from 80 years ago. So that where the eastern forests come back aesthetically 80 or 100 years after impacts, maybe not naturally, the balance of the ecosystem, there's very visible impacts in these desert areas.
Well, if it doesn't recover, it at least gets grown over.
Yeah, that's right. So, but yeah, it's hard to explain that to some folks because if it's like anything else too. If you drive across the interstate in Utah or Nevada, it's like this, I'm glad there's this nuclear test site here. There's nothing else here, but once you get off into these little, and I'm not glad there was a nuclear test site there, by the way. That's a bad joke, but it's where it's one of those things. Oh, let's put it here because there's nothing here. But no, there's a lot of amazing resources.
I would like to say that I just finished reading a book that I started. I bought it at one of the visitor centers, like I think in Zion, and it's like a biography of John Wesley Powell, who was the first person who explored the Grand Canyon in 1869 with his team. And it's by Wallace Stegner, whom I knew as a novelist. And it was written in the early 1950s. So it's not up to date or anything, but it was really interesting, not just about his expedition exploring the Grand Canyon or the Colorado River, but there's a whole lot about his interface with Congress and the development of the U.S. Geological Survey and other governmental agencies. And also he was like the first person who really urged Congress to support science, the science of geology at the time. But I never had read a book like it before. I mean, that was that kind of combination of a biography and about past exploration, and then about the interactions with government. So other people might be interested in that as well. It was called Beyond the 100th Meridian.
Yeah, that's where he drew the line as far as the arid West.
That's right. And
we're
really
living out his prophecy now with the Colorado River.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, the West is definitely a land of extremes. It's interesting. I never knew rivers got smaller when they went downstream until I moved to the West.
Oh, wow.
All right. Any other questions?
Comment for Bob.
No. Okay. And after you, then Millie.
Okay, here's a book that you may be interested in, Bob, about
Cool.
hills and Monument Valley, etc. The use of
I've not seen that. I'll have to jot that down.
It's
Southwest.
Cinema Southwest, John A. Murray. So
cool. I always I love checking movies out for wherever they film them, just trying to figure out where they were. And when you get I know there's that one movie with, this is getting aside, but Kevin Bacon and Meryl Streep, there was a River Wild movie or something. They actually had they were filming it in Montana and in Oregon on the Rogue River, and I forget the river in Montana, but totally different vegetation and rock type. And one scene, the upper part of the rapid was on the Rogue and the lower part was in Montana. So you just, in like 5 seconds, you went from totally different, metamorphic rock to igneous rock to
I'm going to push back on that, because if you drive from here over to the ocean, particularly if you don't go through to Santa Cruz, but go over to the middle of the peninsula, you get very sudden changes in vegetation as you have redwoods up at the top, and then you go through about 2 more stages before you get down to the ocean.
Yeah, oh no, you're right. I kind of got sick of hearing that when I first moved to California. We have the most diverse this, the most that, and then you realize that hopefully no one's from Texas, but unlike Texas, it's true.
I was, but I left.
I mean, when I worked up on the North Coast, we had over 200 inches of rain some winters, and Death Valley goes winters without rain. I mean, it's amazing.
But those are 500 miles apart. This is in a stretch of 20 miles.
Oh yeah, no, I agree.
Profound.
Millie, did you have a question?
Yes, I have seen articles about tulip-shaped wind. Well, they're not like a windmill, but it's tulip-shaped and it catches the wind, and it's more efficient than the windmills. Why are they not used more?
I'm hoping that these giant wind turbines are a temporary, move in a new direction. I mean, the technology's moving so quickly. I'm not a wind energy expert, though. My only involvement with wind and solar was analyzing impacts on the landscape. So that's not my knowledge base. But yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot more that we can do to reduce impacts.
Apparently they're much more efficient and a lot less expensive, and they don't take up all the land.
Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah.
For those in this country,
Yes.
Millie?
Well,
Huh.
I can't remember where I saw the article, but it was very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, they're looking at all kinds of different things with, especially offshore with, using tidal energy and stuff, but I just think it's important for us to know that there's footprints to all of this stuff at varying levels. And
Not
as
only
I look around my big house and look at my pickup truck out there,
the windmills can't be recycled. They're not being made of recycled material, and the same with the solar panels. What's going to
yeah,
happen?
no,
They wear out.
that's a huge impact. Yeah, the waste stream.